There is nothing more hated in the art community than art tracers. Okay, maybe art thieves, and maybe spammers, and NFTs. Also groomers, and I suppose people who might draw pedophilia. Hey, boys and girls, everyone in between, and those outside the binary. I'm Avery, and today I'm going to talk about art tracing, art referencing, and the line between the two. When I first really joined an art community, and I do use the term loosely as I never really interacted with anyone, I was in high school, so around 2010. I created a DeviantArt account, and I discovered bases. I know that 14 sounds a bit old to get into this art stuff, especially when it just comes to knowing things like bases, which really are one of the most basic parts of a lot of online artwork, kind of at the beginning with younger people. But, I was kind of poor and couldn't really afford a good laptop or scanner or a tablet or even really good art supplies that you can't get at the dollar store. So everything I drew was traditional artwork with, mechanical pencils, crappy colored pencils, and cheap pens. And, I was not very good. And these days, seeing 14-year-old artworks, or artwork by 14-year-olds, it's a little soul-shattering for me. I like to tell myself it's just because, they have access to all these things that weren't around when I was 14, but, it might just come down to natural talent, and I suppose the drive at an earlier age than I was to actually learn, how to art and draw. Anyway, I sucked. The way everyone starts out. I had a bit of a late start, but I've gotten over it for the most part, and like everyone else when I first started, I wanted to draw characters. So all of this advice that you would get from people who had been drawing, more than you have, and especially people who learned in a more traditional way, they would give advice about starting with easier things, learning anatomy, and, just learning the basics and structures and everything before actually trying to draw specific characters. And I was like, nah, I'm not doing that. And I do feel like this is more of an approach that we do in sort of more modern times where people really can start out not learning the traditional way. And, you don't really have to take art classes. You can find almost everything on YouTube. Tutorials are everywhere. So really you can start, I think, wherever you want, which is kind of what I did. I started with characters and with people. So this does also explain why I can't draw animals or backgrounds for sheep. Anyway, I found bases, and they were like a godsend for someone like me, and so I started tracing them. I would save them to my computer, put a sheet of paper over it, and use it as a sort of backlight, and just sort of, trace over what I saw. So don't get me wrong, these weren't exactly professional level pieces that I was tracing, right? So for anyone who doesn't know what a base is, it's typically a PNG file, and it's usually an edited picture of a finished work. So usually anime, there are a lot of anime ones, I think, because they're probably a bit easier to work with. So they're just made bald and naked, and they usually have pretty terrible proportions because the people who made them are as bad at anatomy as I am. I mean, was. Was. Sometimes you'd find ones that were well done, and then sometimes you'd even find a completely original one, which is absolutely amazing. But bases are pretty much made to be traced, or in really amateur ways they can be used to just draw on top of. But even if I had access to a tablet and everything, I don't think I would have quite done that, because that seems a little too cheaty. So you're supposed to add a credit in the description about where you got the base from, and part of it was so other people can see it, and others just being somebody put the work in to edit this picture, no matter how kind of bad it was actually edited and how it is sort of lacking in any sort of proportions. And anyway, so I didn't really do that either, and I know it's one of the major sins of the art community, or really art in general, and I am ashamed of that past behavior of not crediting where it was due. Though my logic was that most base makers didn't include credit for the original image that they stripped down, so I don't know, it seemed like already some scummy stuff is going on. So, I mean, you should be the better person in credit, but yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I filled up entire sketchbooks with these bases to the point that I would have half the thing filled up with blank bases, and then I would just be set for months of doing artwork, doing the part that I preferred, I really liked then, which was adding hair and clothing and all of the rest of that fun stuff. So, and it's also a bit of a foreshadowing to what I do during manic episodes as a grown-up, just filling up files and files of the beginning of an art piece and then never going back to it. So I finish a good bunch of these base drawings and then just dump them onto DeviantArt. And just as a preemptive defense, here I was sheltered kind of from the internet and the art community, because seriously, I was like 14 or 15 before I even discovered that you can post art online as an amateur. I had seen more professional pieces, but I hadn't seen that just anyone can do it until I was like 14 or 15 years old. So, it's not a good thing to do, but I didn't really understand why. I didn't understand how much credit is important, because I didn't understand how much work really goes into an art piece like I do now. So, now that I've been more involved in the art community for a few years on Twitter, a little bit on DeviantArt, and some on YouTube, but mostly on Twitter is where I've been hanging out with artists. So I've had a bit of a roller coaster of feelings about my past behaviors. I've seen people who hate tracing and think it's an absolute unforgivable sin and is going to ruin your artistic process and how you learn. But I've also seen artists who actually encourage it so long as you don't post it, which makes sense to me. So, what are my thoughts? Because, well, this is my channel, so I think tracing has actually helped me with my art. Honestly, I don't understand why people think it can be so detrimental. And I know, sure, you're not really studying all of the anatomy like you could with, like doing it sort of traditionally, but muscle memory is a thing, and when I was tracing, I really had a lot of concentration on what my hand was doing, but I could also gauge what I could of the anatomy, though granted, these were really not very good anime bases, so if someone were trying to learn anatomy by tracing something, I would recommend like an actual textbook or something that actually shows you the right thing. But I do almost feel like it's a kindergarten step when it's learning how to draw, is kind of these not really worried about super good proportions, but just trying to get that basic body down, even if it doesn't make any sense. So after years of this tracing, because I had absolutely no ambition to bother getting better, what can I say, I finally buckled down and started learning anatomy and other techniques, and it was actually a lot easier for me than the other times I had tried. One of the reasons that I hadn't done it until now was that it was just really difficult for me to wrap my head around, but once I had already had the practice, it just made a lot more sense in the practical way of trying to learn, and having those reflexes and a good idea of how the process should look when you are doing a full art piece, it really did help me a lot. So if I were talking to someone who uses bases, all I would say is be careful what you post and where you post it, and to be a better person than I was and credit where you can. There are definitely art communities that are very much against bases, and I just would suggest staying away from those places and stay where things are friendly. The base maker would be a good person to credit, but on crediting, also try to credit the original image if you can find it, which can sometimes be hard, but sometimes a reverse Google search can work pretty well on that. I would also suggest using original bases just to be sure no one's getting stolen from, as I suspect most anime bases are, and a lot of them do come from, like, shows, which, when you're taking a still from an anime, it can certainly be harder to credit the right person, but to at least put in, I got it from, like, this anime, or even from, like, this episode, that would be something. So I still use bases to a point, but more as references now. I'm subscribed to this amazing creator on Patreon that I found way back in the days of browsing DeviantArt, and I finally feel like I'm paying them back for all of those years that I got, inspiration from them. So Nuka Babe creates the most adorable chibi references and bases, and who, by the way, is Ukrainian, and though she is safely out of the country, I'm sure that any other help that she could get would be great. So I'm going to have her Patreon linked, and I'll see if I can find another good place that you can donate for the greater population of Ukraine, because, well, there's certainly a lot of bad stuff happening there, and if I forget to do this, I'm going to feel so bad. And another couple of creators I would suggest are Anastasia Berry and Kiblitzer. I always have trouble with that person's name, but I will also have them in the description, but I'll be putting Nuka Babe first. So these are what I use these days for a good amount of my references, are sort of these specifically drawn to be references, pieces from people. And a part of what I like is that the style of the person that I'm referencing, if I really like it, which I do for these creators, I do try to incorporate what I like. And another part is because I'm just really bad at coming up with reference ideas, and another is that I can have this really close look at a stylized part that I maybe have trouble with, like, hands. Because there's definitely a lot of ways that people tackle the problems of hands. And there's a couple of different techniques that I've learned from these people that I kind of do like. So speaking of references, I want to move on into pose references done with photos. As a shout out, I use mostly JukePub and the Pose archives. They're both on Patreon, but they also have DeviantArt accounts and Gumroads. Adorka Stock is another really well-known one and has a lot of free content, but personally I haven't found their quality to be quite up to the same as the others, though their output is insane and they have a lot of different models, so it's definitely something a lot of people I am sure would find very helpful. So the question I've been asking myself is, what are the rules around tracing pictures, specifically ones that are meant to be used as references, and not just, a random Instagrammer that you find? So I took a class in digital art this semester, and so I actually dropped out of a course in digital art this semester because it was a beginners and intro course, and honestly I'd already taught myself most of the stuff, and the videos that my instructor used were like 5 years old, and at the time she had been using Clip Studio, which is the one that I use, for like 6 months, and I've been using it for like 3 years, so it just, I dropped it before, like, you wouldn't get a refund, thank goodness, because that wasn't entirely pointless. But anyway, I might talk about that some other times. But one of the things that we learned was about the technique of tracing photos for artwork. So I did one of my partner, my wife at the time. I think we had been married. I don't remember. Anyway, whatever. So we learned about doing tracing, and I do think it's a great way to learn where to put shadows and highlights when you can compare them directly. Like, look at your piece, and then you can overlay and see exactly where these things would go, and it would be a good technique to kind of learn how you want to be doing your shadows and your highlights. But what about form? What about when you are taking and tracing the form? So one of the things I like about JukePub and the people who do the Pose archives is that they're all pretty fit and kind of standard body types. And I know with some people that they wouldn't really appreciate that, but for me, I like having what is sort of a standard sort of body type. And it's just how I work with it. I think it's easier to pack on and change these body types when I have that sort of base to start with, almost like starting with the skeleton up. But it's not a skeleton, it's a body. Anyway, so I know a lot of people do like having all kinds of body types and models, which is why I would suggest Adorka Stock, because they really do have so many different weight types. And I think there was someone, I think their name was Nova, and I'm gonna feel bad if I have that wrong, who was, I don't know if they were like binary trans or non-binary, but they only had one arm, at the time, which, at the time, I assume they still only have one arm, because you can't really regrow that, but just things like that really make it very inclusive. So, yes, Adorka Stock, great if that's the thing that helps you. So, I do use proportions in the photos that I use, and I do sometimes draw over them to get the right length of legs or broadness of the shoulders with just, lines, or I circle where the joint should be, and it's sort of teaching me, again, how that works, but also it's just really helpful. So what is the line between referencing and tracing? Or rather, when is referencing too much? Is tracing the joints or the length of arms too much? Is tracing the hands, even if you change the final project, too much? I don't think so. Not if it's a photo specifically taken for references and poses. I think if you are referencing someone else's artwork, tracing or even referencing too closely does sound pretty ick to me and really bordering on a sort of copyright infringement thing. But I think if what you're using is something that was specifically made for references, or, even using bases, you should go for it. Pay for it if you have to, and don't trace over something that's clearly marked pay to use, or PTU. And actually, paying or tipping is probably the best way to go about free references in general, because I do imagine it takes a lot of work, especially for the original ones. Like, I have tried to make references and bases from scratch myself, and it's a lot harder for me when I'm not, having a character in mind. So maybe next time I do that, I'll try to do body types specific to my characters. I don't know. Anyway, if you do use the reference super closely, to always credit it. I don't know how I feel about this with the photos, but definitely if I'm using an Anastasia Berry one, I do put credit on okay, this is the person that I got this sort of the style that it is in. I kind of was imitating that as well as using their pose reference. And whenever I use Nuka Babe, I do that every single time because I can't draw chibis worth anything. So, honestly, I just use their stuff to make cute chibis, and I'm not actually really looking to learn off of it. So it's a little bit different. Anyway, I do have a couple of people on Patreon who don't require credit and are you can use this for commercial or for personal art or whatever you want. Don't worry about crediting. But I do still sometimes try to remember to link back to them on my WordPress website, which, hey, if you want to check it out, it's going to be in the description. Woo woo. Anyway, photos, they're definitely more of a gray area to me. But again, I think you should credit photos that aren't references, that you use closely. I think that's a good thing to do. I still don't really know about photos that are meant to be references. I think it's good to share them so you can, more people can find the tools, but I don't know if it's something I would say is required. In the end, if used right and honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong with tracing, especially at the beginning of your art experience. But it's also important not to use it as a crutch, and remember that you need to stretch your art wings to keep improving. I was stuck for years in one place because I was too scared to try and move on from just using bases and tracing. But it's really not that bad when you finally take that step. And always, always credit where it's needed. No artwork is ever worth being labeled as an art thief, even if it was an accident. Alright. Well, I think that's all of the main thoughts that I have for now. I'll see you all with another topic next time and another art piece, or maybe I'll finish the one that's on screen now. I don't quite know yet. I will also have sort of a transcript of this posted on my blog, and I'll have a link there because, I don't know, sometimes people just like to read instead of watch, which is me most of the time, but it's kind of weird to do that with YouTube videos, but it's kind of a principle thing. Okay, anyway, thanks for listening. I'll see you next time, or, talk to you next time, because I don't actually see and there's no camera. Okay, bye!